everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction, Andrea. So welcome to my talk, as Andrea was mentioning, from data to value, driving biomechanical innovations with wearables and data augmentation. So I'm going to structure it in kind of two parts here. First of all, I'm going to introduce Salzburg Research, so the place I'm working at, as well as my research group, the Human Motion Analytics Group. And I will show you some data science projects that we did and what you could do if you work in data science. Then I'm going to dive a little bit into an issue in human motion research that led to my PhD thesis, data generation and augmentation. So first of all, Salzburg Research is located in Salzburg, close to the main train station in the science city Itzling. Some of you might know it from the university because it's close to the Department of Artificial Intelligence and Human Interfaces. Basically, we are an independent, non-profit research and technology organization that is an applied research institute doing research for these different fields, so basically mobility, energy, health, and sports. And I'm working in the Human Motion Analytics Group. We are 16 people with completely different backgrounds. Most of them are like data scientists, but from statistics or from machine learning, so basically from just like every area you can imagine. We also have some project managers or developers, and also sensor experts. So basically, when we work along the data value chain introduced by Lim et al. In 2018. It's kind of a step-by-step process to get from data to value. But before I dive into that, I will focus on this data collection part. So basically, what kind of data sources do we really have? So we can see there is a lot of sensors that you could use. There are sensors for biomechanical measurements, but also for physiological and psychological measurements. Well, I have to say that for psychological measurements, we rarely do that within our group. We focus more on these other two areas. For these sensors, we mostly use wearables because there is a portable sensor technology that you can just take with you in the fields at home. Some of you might have a fitness watch or a breast strap that can be used for collecting this kind of data. And it's also easy to have at home, for example, for rehabilitation. You can take it home and then use it there. And there's a huge shift from lab to field because it gets more and more important to assess human motions within the field and instead of a lab where you always have this like fixed environment. Wearables allow for longitudinal and location-independent and real-time data collection. So let's dive into the sensors that we have. Starting with the biomechanical measurements, we always want to know a force, some pressure or movement and orientation of people or objects within space. In this case, we can use motion capture, which is an optical markerless solution in this case using IMUs that I will tell you later on. And we use that, for example, for a rider when horseback riding or also for motorcycle riding that Marie will tell you more about. Then we also have, as I mentioned before, IMUs, so-called inertial measurement units. They can be seen here on the blue circles on the right-hand side. So these are just like small boxes that you put on certain aspects of the body, and you can measure the linear and the angular acceleration and in different orientations. So you can see an example here of a foot IMU when someone was running for 10 kilometers per hour on a ground level. Other sensors for pressure, for example, we use these sensor pressure insoles that are placed within the shoe as an insole, and you can see the distribution of the foot when walking or even when running. This is often chosen for rehabilitation or running assessment. For force, we use load pads that measure the force between two objects. Now, for the physiological parameters, some of you might know, as I mentioned before, the Apple Watch or any other watch that measures the heart rate and heart rate variability. These will all fall under physiological parameters. But there's, of course, also the EMG or other stuff. But we mostly use these kind of sensors. And just to mention them here, this would be some psychological measurements, for example, the EEG and so on, but we're not really using this. Okay, so let's go back to the data value chain. I will introduce you to a project that we did recently, or not really recently, but in 2022 to 23, which was the connected boot, as mentioned earlier. So for the data collection, we used a skiing boot mounted with an IMU and connected it to a phone in order to collect some data when people were skiing down the slope, and we analyzed each turn. After we got the data, we had to analyze it. So here's where all the signals processing, as well as machine learning and statistics are involved. So we had to figure out each turn within the whole sequence, for example, and then in order to assess the quality of the ski turns, we extracted a carving score. And at the end, people like you could use it on the slope and define how good your skiing is. And that all sounds pretty good and pretty linear, but it is actually not at all. So if you ever worked in a new product development, you will see that there are a lot of iterations, either being due to the technology readiness level, which is, for example, if you have a sensor, you go out in the field, you see that something is not really measuring right, or there is an issue with the sensor, so you have to go back, reverse engineer, for example, and then try test it out again. So there are some iterations, and also for the concept readiness level. Some companies might not know what they want to achieve, how good it should be, what the expected time delay is, for example. So in worst case, we also have to go back. And that's where we try to put fitness for purpose in the center of everything. And we being the head of our group, Elisabeth Häusler, she did her PhD in this area. And I want to start with this nice site from Harvey and Green, with fitness for purpose is one of many understandings of product quality. And if the product does not fit its purpose, then its perfection is irrelevant. And that's a really essential point, because if you can't really use it, then what matters if the accuracy is great? So that's why we start with fitness for purpose. And from that, we define the goals, the aims, and the requirements within the company. So for example, for the connected boot, this was done with Atomic to define the accuracy that they wanted to have, and also the okay time delay. From that, we came to the most important part. We have to define the construct. The construct is what we really want to measure, either stress, or in our case, the quality of a ski turn. And from that, of course, we have to make it measurable. So how can we measure a good ski turn? Therefore, we had to go back to the lab and try to figure out a gold standard, therefore, based on solid scientific foundations. So we really had to see, okay, how can we make it measurable? And we find out that the angle of attack on the slope is a good quality or measurement of the quality of a ski turn. So that's where we decided which kind of sensor to use in order to get the expected delay and so on. And this is where we found out IMU is a good fit for that. And this is how we do our projects within the Human Motion Analytics group. And now, as there was already a peek preview, I'm going to show you a few of our projects that we had so far. So here we can see a project that was done in cooperation with the German Bob and Skeleton Association. Here we wanted to help coaches to really identify and measure steering maneuvers within the ice channel. So here we really had to think about how can we recognize the steering maneuvers, and also how can we detect these weight shifts that lead to the steering maneuvers within the ice channel. And this was done by a force pads or load pads that we put in the toboggan on 6 critical points: shoulders, the hand placements, and also the horns, because this is where the athletes will steer the toboggan down the ice channel. And then we processed the information for immediate feedback. We tested this in the lab beforehand, which was basically just our office. Therefore, we had an Olympionique who was working with us, and he was trying it out over video. And it was working pretty well, so we went to the ice channel. This is another project that was used for enhancing sport motivation for beginner runners and keep them running. Here the question was, how can I get into the flow when running? And also, how can I reduce the effort? And therefore, this was a kind of really interesting experiment or project, because we had to develop our own sensor that you could see here. We had to do a sensor that can detect step rates as well as breathing patterns. And therefore, a colleague of mine designed this wearable chest strap with conductive threads. So if you breathe in, they act like a pressure sensor that you can collect data with. And then, from that, we generated a breathing algorithm that gave you auditorial feedback for your running, and thereby improved your running. Used was, as you can see here, a deep learning algorithm, especially LSTMs in combination with CNNs. This project is about prosthesis wearers, but I'm just going to skip over that because I have a poster session later where this and the next project will be mentioned again. So just come by and I'm going to introduce you to these projects. This is really cute, so just come by to see more pictures of him. The last project that I want to focus on is a project that we did recently. This was in combination with the firefighters in Salzburg, where we wanted to develop a cooling algorithm to help them reducing heat stress. Because if you have heat stress, the decisions that you might take will be risky and could eventually lead to death or hopefully only injury. So we had, first of all, this was really interesting because what is heat stress? How could we measure heat stress? Because everyone is so individual to heat. And also, how can we avoid that? Together with the University of Salzburg, with the psychology and sports psychology department was the last question. We were not really involved in that, so I'm going to focus on the first two ones. So here, we first of all had to decide how can we measure the heat stress. So what we did was we put them on a treadmill and also on the sauna, and using humidity sensors, we measured the sweat rate. We also had to do some reverse engineering because sweat was not really good for the sensors, we figured out. So we had to change that as well, and we used it to kind of estimate the body core temperature, and it was working. So therefore, we could train our algorithms to detect for the individuals the right time to really focus on this cooling and enable the cooling mechanism. And this was a really, really nice project because at the end, we could go to the fire container and try it out like in real scenarios. Okay, and I want to stop with our projects with the Digital Motion Next project, which is one of our biggest projects that we're doing. It's a continuation of the Commit Demo project we did the last 4 years. It is a funded project with bringing together transdisciplinary expertise in the field of digital motion from 26 partners over 6 countries in the field of academia, but also industries. So if you want to know more about this one, you can go to our webpage. There's a lot of information on this. So now that we know the projects, I want to dive a little bit into my PhD topic, which is challenges in biomechanics, especially the data. So therefore, I just want to introduce a little bit on the project that I was working on. It was to estimate joint kinetics, which is really expensive, slow, time-consuming, and normally is done in the lab. But we already know that wearable sensors allow for a fast and in-field assessment in the field, and there we saw that we could use IMU data and pressure data to map this to joint kinetics. This was published in Sports Biomechanics just recently, like 2 weeks ago, which is nice for timing now. And there we had 24 participants, theoretically. Because often in human motion you have some kind of issues, because you're so dependent on these sensors. So we often have sensor issues while collecting data. This looks like that, for example. This is one run of one person outside in the field with some IMUs, just like in the X acceleration orientation, but for foot, shank, and thigh. And in thigh, for example, we could see that the left IMU collected a few data points, and then it was just nothing. Whoops. And this is also happening quite often. And this was only one person for one orientation. So yeah, there's a lot of issue here. Also, the lack of subject is really, really an issue here. So we know that machine learning models, especially deep learning models that we are using, need a large amount of data to generalize well, especially to new data. And therefore, if you do not have it, the machine learning models will be highly dependent on the subject. So the performance will vary across the individual, which was also reported by Knudsen et al. And they also lack statistical power, tend to over and underfit, and are really, really hard to interpret. And that's where I come in with my PhD topics. I'm looking at data augmentation, which is basically defined here. So either modifying samples, put them back in as data augmentation, or generating new samples by using generative models like GANs, for example, that will produce new data with similar statistical properties. And this all is really nice because it kind of alleviates all of the problems that we have and also lowers the financial and time constraints that we have when collecting data, which is, of course, for companies quite important. But this is often done in like image vision. So you have flipping, you have cropping, and so on, and you can really spot those bad augmentations, because if you rotate an image and the sky is suddenly below the ground, it's embed augmentation. But for time series data, this is not that easy because you have temporal dependencies between these between 2 points. And if you start shuffling them, they will destroy the whole structure within. So this is where my PhD comes in. So I took a look at all the different ways that you can augment data, either data-driven using generative models, or classic using noise and so on, so noise, jittering, warping, and also physics-based, which is kind of complicated and more on the sports science part, so I'm not going to dive into this one, because that's not my expertise. Yeah, and I found out that there is not really a method to use when you want to augment data. It always depends on the specific study goal, available computational resources, and especially here, the biomechanical fidelity, because adding noise will not introduce anything meaningful to your dataset. But there's also some issues here, because the assessments of augmentation techniques is done on downstream models. And downstream models, for example, was the CNN that I mentioned before with the estimation of the joint kinetics. If we enlarge our dataset using some method, we then see, okay, let's predict the joint kinetics. Oh, the predictions were better, so the augmentation technique was perfect. But we don't really know what does it do. How does it really influence the decision? And there is not really anything to evaluate this. So this is something that is really worth looking into. And also, what my main focus is, there's a lack of data. And we know that. But we want to use these, for example, generative models to generate more data. But there is a lack of data in the first place, so how can we properly train them? And that's where I come into play. So I try to find new training ways of these generative models so that they can kind of work with this limited data set. And to come to an end, basically one could say that data generation could never replace real data collected in motion, in human motion especially, but it can still help us develop valid and statistically meaningful models with a limited number of test subjects. These are some images that I took, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Christina, for your super interesting talk. We have now a few minutes for questions. I will keep it short because, as we heard, Christina will be around also in the afternoon at the exhibition, so you can post all your questions you have. But maybe there is the one or the other super urgent question here in the room.
I have two questions or comments. One thing I thought about transfer learning. Can you take your findings, let's say, from the firefighter and the problem with heat and transfer it to hiking maybe and coldness? This was one point. Mm-hmm. What came to my mind. And the other thing is women are not small men. So I thought, did you take the gender aspect in this project into account? Because I'm never hot. I'm always just cold everywhere.
So with the firefighter, we actually discussed it. The problem was that within the Salzburg Firefighter, I don't know, association, or how you call them, they wanted to mostly focus on men in this case. But if I go back to this study, so here we always, so the 24 participants, it was equally distributed. So we always see that we have at least equal distribution between these two genders. But as I was saying, that theoretically, of course, it could happen that for women, more data was like failing due to any reasons. So there could be a shift here. And with the transfer learning, when I was showing you this data here, here, this one, here we use transfer learning, for example, because we figured out that in lab on the treadmill and lab overground running, meaning a force plate where we just have to step on to measure this, they were pretty similar. So we used transfer learning to further optimize it for, in this case, in the field outside, and it was working pretty well. So this could also be how you can counteract this data issue. But you have to have these similar things you're working on, so you can really use transfer learning in this case. But yeah, it is possible.
Thanks for the answers. Thanks for the questions. Online? Any question from the online community? No? Therefore, okay, one last question, and then the others, please, out there at the exhibition.
All right, thank you. The question I have is on your data value chain. Mm-hmm. From what you explained, I can actually see that I couldn't pick where you talked about the information delivery. maybe I was expecting something visual, but I think I could only catch...
In this one?
Yes.
And you couldn't figure out?
No. Like in your data value chain before this. Yes, exactly. So the information delivery, that's the third to the last.
Yep.
Yes, I couldn't capture anything on that because I was expecting something visual. So I don't know.
Ah, okay. In this case, for example, it was, as you can see here, the mobile app on this side. So every time after you went down the slope, you could like visual it on your phone, each of the swings that you took, each of the turns. And this is how we provided it for the user. But we also decided on some, maybe I can say it here, like skiing prototypes where the ski was showing you how good you were skiing. But it was such a huge distraction when going down the slope that we decided to not do it like that and rather have it at the app that people can look in when waiting for the lift. No worries.
Thanks again for the question and for the answer. Thanks again to Christina for a great talk. And with that said, we continue with the questions in the afternoon.